Alrighty, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable. I am one of your hosts, Sam Whitfield, joined here tonight by Joshua Johnson and Gabe Icaboni, and as promised, we are going to be discussing the State of the Union tonight. And for those of you who tuned into the Whitfield report last night, most of you already know what my opinions are on the State of the Union. But as always, I think a roundtable discussion, uh, or I'm not really sure how our table would be shaped if we actually had like
The
a little.
triangle table. Triangle table for three of us. But,
Yeah. Someone actually DM'd me last night on Twitter and was like, is that really a good name for the podcast since there are three of you? So I don't know, but it's a cool sounding name, folks. When we came up with the podcast, so that's all that
what,
matters.
what people need to know is that originally there were more of us, but some of our comrades fell in the Great Meme War of 2016. That's not.
It was a glorious but short-lived battle.
Yeah, so so when we started this thing, we actually did have enough for a round table, but now it's more of like a sad square, or something at like a restaurant or one of those family diners. But anyway, I digress. As we mentioned, we're going to be discussing State of the Union. One of the things I mentioned last night on my show, and I wanted to get your guys' take, is what were your expectations going into the State of the Union, if any? Mine were very low. Uh,
Um, I guess I was hoping he would defend the wall a little bit more. But really, I guess I wasn't looking at it as a high or low expectation thing. I was just incredibly anxious about what he was going to say about Venezuela, and eventually he got to that. But we'll get into that a little bit later, I think.
I'll I'll just kind of say that I thought, because the reason I kind of had low expectations was because I thought with the shutdown, going on beforehand, the mainstream media, and of course I'm not really surprised by this, they were all saying that because of the shutdown, Trump was going to have a difficult time at the State of the Union. He was going to get like a lot of backlash and whatnot, and that it just wasn't going to be good for him. So I wanted to say that I bought the mainstream media narrative, but I definitely was kind of pleasantly surprised that there was much more high energy than originally projected. So
I have to say I was impressed by it. I mean, I guess going in there were kind of two themes, which was how 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 uncompromising Trump would be, or how antagonistic, and how much he would talk more about bipartisanship. And I think he did a good job, kind of cutting or kind of balancing the two. I mean, because there were themes in his speech that were bipartisan in nature, but he also, and Josh, I'm sure you and I will talk about it a little bit later on the issue of abortion. I mean, he didn't take any prisoners on that one. That one was pretty much, that one was pretty much your baby killers and I'm not.
yeah, I would have to say, just kind of in general, Trump. I was in a Facebook group chat watching the State of the Union, and everyone was pretty much unanimous that, Trump's trolling. Trump reached troll level 1,000 the other night at the State of the Union, just with a little subtle jabs. And what was really impressive in terms of his drawing was he even got all those Democrat women, in white, or as I referred to them, the female KKK. He even got he even got them all to stand up and applaud at one point, and he was like, "No, you guys aren't supposed to. You guys aren't supposed to applaud. You guys aren't supposed to stand up." So
I will actually have something to say a little bit later about that because I was slightly off put by. I know I'm not the only one either because I've seen other people, but I was slightly off put by that little section of the speech that got them to all start standing up and clapping.
Yeah, well, you and I both. But I'm off put by all that sort of feminist stuff anyway, because I'm because I'm a misogynist. No, not really. But that's what my detractors like to
Well,
say.
how dare we want men to have jobs? Come on, Josh. You should know that women should run the world.
It's and I don't really want us to start on this because I was kind of a little bit later in the speech, but my issue with it in brief was that when we're in the middle of a demographic catastrophe, really, should we really be saying, hey, you know what we need? We need more women in the workforce. We don't need more mothers. We need more women in the workforce. I just don't think it's helpful when you look at that. But we'll get into that later, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, we'll pick that up later, and I'm sure that Josh and I alone could probably do like a 3-hour podcast on the whole demographics and equality and quote unquote equality and all that
Well, but I think
nonsense.
I think that whole interplay it speaks to how firmly entrenched the belief is that women are somehow playing from behind in society, and how they need to over celebrate every success that they have to the detriment of men. And it's like we've known for a long time that women have been getting the majority of the jobs from the recession. The jobs that have been coming up since the recession ended have been jobs that they've been taking at a greater rate. I mean, this is not new. It's not like a bunch of women just suddenly enter the workforce for the first time and it's some great new, never before happened success.
Well,
So,
even the
to me,
even
that was what was most off-putting about it.
even the whole shtick with the block of Democratic women all wearing the same outfit. That's not even new. I think this is what is this the third or fourth time we've seen that now in the State of the Union where they
I
Yeah,
all
that's not
say
new.
the
you
same thing.
know I think they were even doing that during Obama's presidency too. Now that I think about it, I mean,
So that whole and they do it for feminism. For our listeners who don't know, the whole idea of that unified outfit deal is to show the women block or whatever because the Democratic men, as Joe Manchin, there I don't know if you guys saw it, but there was a meme that was going around today, and it has the look on Ocasio Cortez's face at Joe Manchin every time he stood up to clap. Uh, but no, the caption on the meme was, "If you've ever dated a Latino woman, you know what this glare means." And and but anyways, only the women do that, and the whole idea is it's supposed to be a female solidarity thing. But at this point, it's like some boring Chinese Communist Party political stunt that they do at every Central Committee meeting because, like we've said, it's not new. They just do it every year.
I'm sure you also saw the meme, and this is what I was referring to earlier. I'm sure you saw the meme that also said, "I haven't seen this many Democrats in white since the KKK back in the 1800s." So, uh, and that was also true. That was where my mind immediately jumped even before that, before the meme came out. But anyway, I suppose we should kind of go in order and save that for a bit later, though. So I mean, where to start? Just I guess I guess since everyone wants to discuss the wall and what you know the impact of it at the State of the Union, let's just start there. So I actually thought that Trump did a pretty good job addressing the issue of the wall. And it was really just I loved seeing how uncomfortable Nancy Pelosi looked during that whole entire. Well, she looked uncomfortable during the whole entire speech. Let's be honest, but she looked extra uncomfortable during the wall part of it.
I thought she was insanely disrespectful all night. the constant shuffling of her papers and reading. There were a few times I actually bust out laughing the first time it happened because I thought maybe she just really wasn't paying attention. But she kept on having these moments where she would be standing up reading a paper, and then everybody else would sit down and be done clapping, and she'd stay standing like the only one in the room beside Trump standing for 2 or 3 minutes before she looked up and realized, oh, I need to sit down again.
Yeah, I have to say that's the first time I've ever seen a State of the Union address where the speaker is actually shuffling papers. And I know why. And I know why she was doing it. And I don't. I mean, I know why she was doing it. I think it honestly backfired on her. I think it made her look worse. I mean, nobody loves Pelosi other than people who are diehard partisans, but I think it made her look smaller during the speech because it's really hard not to figure out what she's trying to do. Like, you have to be really dense not to figure out what she's trying to do, which is basically just bother Trump and distract him.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Moving on to the wall, though, I guess I'll play devil's advocate. I wasn't really disappointed, but I thought it was kind of underwhelming. And it's not really Trump's fault, but he's been kind of or Jared has sort of convinced him to water it down to the point where I said to a friend of mine I was watching it with, I said, in which Trump tries to sell a fence as a wall. And that's not a bad thing, but I don't like the way we insist on calling it. And he sort of blocked himself into a corner on this one, so I guess there's that. But I don't really like how we insist on calling it a wall, even though at this point we're essentially arguing for a slightly larger fence.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. And obviously, I think the can you guys still hear me? By the way, I'm kind of
I can, yep.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to fix this soundboard because if I can get it to play, I have some really good clips that we can use for Pelosi. But anyway, I think the big thing that people always miss with the wall is I actually asked some of my Democrat friends, just people who are opposed to the wall in general, what they think the wall is going to be. And I suppose this isn't really a surprise once you think about it. But the whole those who are opposed to the wall, there's a big fear that if Trump gets his way, we're going to be building a whole big Berlin Wall, complete with floodlights and barbed wire and communist and Nazi guards, in bell towers, just, shooting down anyone who, tries to either escape or come across the border, which is, so essentially it's like a horror movie, where you can't escape. And that might seem laughable, to us, but to them, that's like the legit fear, of what the wall is going to be. So, whereas Trump basically, as just said, wants to build a bigger fence. So.
Well, I mean, I think it was Trump continuing to stake his or continuing to place his stake in the ground about it, but I think he knows he's not going to get what he wants out of the speech. I mean, basically, that section of the speech was him just rehashing all over again what what have been his reasons for arguing for the wall, have been for a while. So
Yep.
it didn't tread any new ground.
I'll put it this way: Trump literally spent more time talking about cancer, children with cancer, and World War II than he did talking about immigration. So that really wasn't the focus of the State of the Union, I don't think either. I will say, going on to that topic, though, that I found it kind of amusing that when it came to talking about unity, we were scraping very bottom of the barrel, very basic levels of human decency to try and get both parties to stand up and agree on something. And even then, some of them wouldn't do it. Ocasio-Cortez didn't stand up for the poor cancer kid even. So the whole unity shtick, or that there is any real bipartisanship that's going to happen, while I wish it were true, it's just a really sad joke at this point, because if you can't, if you're going for we need to stand up against children having cancer as your message to unify people, that's kind of setting a low bar. Um, and I would say, though, that as we've discussed before on here, I did like when he brought up the infrastructure, because that is one area where I would hope that some bipartisan consensus could be reached. And if it can't, then I think it just speaks to how utterly insane the Democratic Party has gone, because they've wanted that for years, and this is your shot, and you're gonna blow it. You're gonna throw it away because you don't like who the president is.
Yeah, I will say that was it took a lot to get everybody to cheer. I'm not gonna lie. I have expected when Trump talked about cancer for Democrats to stay seated. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, so did I. And I mean, I kind of remember during that whole part when Trump was talking at cancer, like you could literally see Pelosi in the back, like saying something like, "Oh fuck, now I have to clap." Like I don't want to, but damn it, I'm gonna look like even more of a bitch if I don't. So
Yeah,
Here's the real question. And maybe Gabe, because you're sort of my point man on this kind of thing. Has there ever been a State of the Union, at least since they were televised? Maybe maybe Andrew Johnson, I don't know, but at least since they were televised, where it was so blatantly obvious that that that, that there was no consensus and that both sides of the chamber wanted to kill each other. It seemed like.
no, not to my knowledge. I mean, I think the well, I no, I don't think so. I mean, it was clearly obvious. And actually, I was reading an article about it the other day, and then I actually watched the replay of the State of the Union on YouTube. And there were members at certain part, especially the freshmen. There were freshman members who didn't know whether to get up and clap or not during certain parts of Trump's speech. And you can sort of see when the camera pans out, the older members were sort of like moving their hands up as if to say, yeah, you guys and gals need to stand up and clap. I mean, because they didn't, it's pretty clear they didn't want to do it, but they didn't know whether decorum demanded it or how it would look to the cameras
That
yeah,
I
on,
saw that
on pretty basic
Ocasio.
things.
Pardon?
On pretty basic things. I mean, I'm not talking about,
yeah.
things like abortion or the wall. I'm talking about like, again, cancer.
I actually saw that right before we went on the air tonight. I was watching a video of Ocasio, and I don't, maybe they have cameras on all of them. I don't know, but this seemed like it was a camera that was just sitting dead locked on her all night. And you could see there were moments where she looked around, except she would see other people clapping and getting up, and then she would just stay sitting anyway. It was kind of funny, but
I you
because
know
like she would crane her head completely all the way around, like she would lean forward in her seat and look and try and see if you could tell what she was looking for, and then she just chose not to do anything anyway.
Josh, it's funny that you mentioned that because last night on my show, you know, for those of you who may be listening to this on audio podcast, I highly encourage you to go back and watch last night's uh, YouTube video of the Whitfield report, because I actually made a point of pointing out like a few times in the State of the Union when Ocasio Cortez and other Democrats, you could see that they were literally conversing with each other. And I'm not like a lip reader, but they seemed to like ask the question of like, well, should we, like, they were conferring on whether or not they should, stand and clap with each other on like, on relatively basic things. And
I
yeah.
I'll let you finish because I had a thought on that.
And I just thought that it was like it was just kind of like, well, geez, you guys really are like a pack of sheep, like, you know, waiting for. I mean, the fact that you guys need to, like, you know, have like a 30-second conference discussion on whether or not you guys will stand and clap over like some pretty basic things. It's like I'm not even so sure. I'm not even sure the Republicans hated Obama that much that they had to do that during
The
Obama's State of the Unions.
the thing is, they're not the only sheep in there, though, or maybe sheep's not the appropriate term, but I took issue with the idea, and it's not just this State of the Union; it's every State of the Union. I've slowly gotten more cynical and just tired of the whole charade over the last few years, not just under this president, but under Obama and past ones. But the notion that the members of Congress need to get up and clap every other sentence almost to show they support the president, that they presumably, if it's their own party, they presumably should support anyway. And the point at which they began chanting USA, 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 it seems to me almost, and I think that people in Middle America watching this, not just the State of the Union, but any of them, kind of look at it and see one big circle jerk, because it's basically the political class sitting up there talking about the things that they're most concerned about and then applauding the fact that they're discussing the things that they're concerned about. I just, it's political theater, really. A lot of it is. And I
Yeah,
think, to me, it's just silly. Like I remember somebody else said to me during the first 15 minutes or so, they said, remember, everyone, we don't need to stand up and clap after every other word he says.
well, I also remember thinking like I remember like people making like a big deal about like the whole unity thing of, like, you know, of everyone coming together for the childhood, you know, cancer thing. And I'm like that's kind of a bad argument because um imagine if imagine if Trump had said that and someone like sat down, you know, during the whole we should eradicate child cancer. Like that's like one of those things where, like, well, duh, everyone is going to, you know, support that. That's not like a unification moment. We should all be behind eradicating childhood childhood cancer. And if you don't stand for that, you're gonna look like a dick. So
I, uh, I think, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe this might be a good time to segue into the whole the thing about women, because that was one of those points where they did seem to have that rare moment of unanimous applause from both sides of the aisle.
yeah, yeah. What? Yeah. Oh boy. Well, Josh, since you were the one who brought it up, I'll just let you start.
I was gonna
So.
say we should let Josh take the lead on this one because he's rearing to go.
Well, yeah. Well, the thing to me, watching the speech, it didn't really start to get meaty for me until that wasn't real. That was like the last non-meaty moment, but it did bother me. And then he got into abortion, and it kind of began rolling. But there was this point for our viewers, or our listeners, I should say, who didn't watch the speech or read it or whatever, where Trump just starts going on this sort of bizarre tangent about how many women there are in the Congress and how many women CEOs we have in America and how many women there are who are working. And he did use it to bring up at least one good point. I will say that I agree, even though I disagree with Ivanka on probably everything else. The only positive thing she's contributed to this administration is the push for paid family leave, because that is something we need, because it would enable people to, especially millennials, to look at having a family and not having to worry so much about the unfortunately growing financial strains of that. But the thing is, while he's praising all of these women, and I'll let Gabe address more of the point about men who are not taking these jobs, because that's an issue as well. But it wasn't my complaint about it so much. It is a complaint of mine, but it wasn't the one that I was immediately thinking of. But the thing is, as I mentioned earlier, if you read or pay attention to politics or anything at all like this, you have no doubt heard about the baby bust we were in. Just, I think it was maybe a week before the State of the Union came out, the new report or the new study said that America is not having enough children to remain above replacement level. And this is bad news, especially considering entitlements, because we need to have more young people than we do older people if you want to continue to see and our safety net's not too terribly strong in the first place. I've complained about that a lot on this show, and you guys know I complain about it anyway. So I'm doubly concerned because we already have a kind of weak safety net, and it will only get weaker if our tax base keeps on shrinking. And it's not just the shrinking tax base, but it is the societal problems that begin to arise when you see demographic decline, like we've sort of seen in Japan. And I'm that's a whole tangent for another time. But I think I've discussed on here before the whole myriad of problems that they've had in terms of gender relations and sexuality and attitudes towards families and having children that they've had as a result of their increasingly old population, while the young people are seemingly totally disinterested in continuing on the country by having children and contributing to their country in that way. And it speaks to very troubling cultural to very troubling cultural trends that are common in how we think about these things. And so, for example, one of those, as I've sort of mentioned, is this notion that we need women working and that we need to have more. And I'm not opposed to women working, but right now, when you're having a situation where there are not where we're not above replacement level, maybe it would be a good idea if the president came out and said, "Hey, look, our culture vilifies women who choose to be mothers all the time, but anybody who has chosen to prioritize their family life can tell you how much of a full-time job that is on its own, how challenging it is on its own, and how rewarding it is on its own." And we're not saying that has to be exclusively what you do, but by the same, the other side of the coin, if you will, encouraging women to basically become men and to prioritize career above all else, and to wait until they're out after their childbearing years, the years during which they're most fertile, to postpone family until after they've crossed that bridge is not it's not having a positive impact on our society. And instead of challenging that, he sort of just rolled with that cultural trend of saying, "Yep, this is good. This is what we need." And I was bothered by it. I guess I'll let you guys follow up there, and we can kind of pick it up from there.
Yeah, Josh, I kind of, I mean, I do have to, agree with you there. My take on it is slightly different. I actually, I actually kind of thought that again, Trump was kind of reaching master troll level there by bringing that up. It just goes to show that Trump is not the sexist that the left makes him out to be. Clearly, is my volume super low again? I'm not getting a super high.
I think you're okay still.
Okay.
I think you're okay.
Okay.
I will say, I mean, I agree with Josh. Ultimately, I take a slightly different tack on it, not disagreeing with what you said, Josh, but just that it sort of perpetrates a myth that I think a lot of women and I think a lot of people in society believe, which is that somehow we need to create more jobs for women because they don't have any access to it, and there aren't these kinds of jobs when these are the kinds of jobs that have been being created for the last 50 years. I mean, when you think about it and connecting it to what's going on broadly in America right now, the suicide epidemic that's hitting middle America is not a bunch of women committing suicide because they have nothing to do with their lives. You know who's committing suicide at higher rates than at any time in our history? It's white middle-aged men who are generally lower income, who occupy the kinds of jobs that are not being created at the level that they used to be. And in turn, the jobs that are being created are more office administrative type positions that women are predominantly filling. So it's sort of continuing to perpetrate this myth that men are dominating society, and that means that they're dominating employment, which hasn't been true for the last 30 years.
I would add it's not even just particularly white men, because as I think I mentioned on here once before, I went to Denver to the Western Conservative Summit about 2 years ago now, and I actually picked up a book from I believe it was AEI, but it was the I can't remember the title of it now. It was basically exactly what Gabe's talking about. It was basically it wasn't so much of a book as it was a demographic report or a study or whatever whatever you want to call it, and it addressed the steep decline in men in higher education as students or as teachers. It addressed the steep decline in men in the boardroom. It addressed and the fact that while there may be a lot of them now today, that doesn't really show us 20 years in the future. Because if you look at the students that are being trained to fill those roles one day, they are overwhelmingly women. It talked about the way that our public school system prioritizes young girls over young boys because young boys tend to be a little bit rowdier and they get sort of punished for that. Instead of acknowledging that, hey, maybe they learn differently because they are different. And it addressed all these things, but I just wanted to add, it wasn't specifically just white men; it was men across the board who are sort of taking a beating on this, if you will.
Men are taking a beating in multiple areas. Specifically, I didn't want to bring this up, although I think I might have brought this up on previous podcasts. I can't remember, but one of the other big problems that men are facing, it's not just economically and whatnot that where men are struggling, and it's not just the economics and the facts and figures. Men are being demonized from a very early age across races and different economic demographics as being inherently as being quote unquote inherent rapists. And I'm not making that up either. I remember when I was in high school, so going back to 2013, we had an entire Amnesty International Day where a bunch of liberal speakers came in to talk out their, causes and whatnot. Some of it, I guess, was okay, like world hunger and whatnot, but the vast majority of it was all male bashing. In fact, I didn't even make it through the entire day because I remember one speaker in particular. She came in and she discussed how she talked about how she was raped on a college campus by a man she knew, and during her speech she made a pretty what I thought was a pretty uh, flagrant statement saying that every single man in this room in the scene. Now this was for the entire class. Every single young man in this room is a potential rapist. And I got up and left, and we weren't allowed to leave. But I told security that I was leaving. So help me God. Um, and I mean, it just goes to show that this demonization of males and in male culture, and it's been going on for a while, is really dangerous because, as Josh said, it is concerning that millennial families are not having kids. I think it's also troubling that many millennial men aren't dating. That's not to say, that a lot of us aren't for lack of trying, but a lot of my friends who I know, they don't want to date because they hear these stories of, women making false rape accusations and they kind of think, oh, well, F it. You know,
Well,
it's.
I'll say this, and we're going to talk way more on this in depth later. So I'm not going to say everything I want to say on it because I think we're gonna hold off a lot of that till we get to Virginia.
Yeah.
Um, but if you look at these, and you should look at it this way, but if you look at these things from a metaphysical level, you understand, and this is what my issue has been with Me Too from the very beginning. I've said on this podcast before that right the very night that the Weinstein story broke, I just got this deep sense that there was something supernaturally wrong. I mean, I'm not defending him. What he did was wrong, but the way the media was covering it, I had a deep sense that there was something supernaturally wrong with the kind of movement that was starting to just sort of blossom at that time. And I went
Mm-hmm.
down to my church and I immediately prayed about it. And I just prayed to God that whatever this was, it would not result in a further division of men and women, because that's not what God wants. God does not want man and women to be opposed to one another or to be in fear of one another. It's deeply unfortunate, and I've seen it like exactly what you're talking about, Sam. I've seen it far too often with young women in our generation and in the media saying that every man is a potential Ted Bundy, and that they are convinced that every man they meet, they're looking at them, they've got their guard up because they think that guy is going to be the one to rape them, and that's not what God wants for these women. He doesn't want anybody to live in that kind of borderline hysterical fear, especially not when you consider why God made man and women, what God made humanity for. He wants his creations to love one another and to engage with one another. And that's why I take such issue with this, because it's a continuation. It's building on the whole Me Too revolution is building on the failed presumptions of the last sexual revolution. And you can't fix it. It doesn't fix the problem. It just gets us farther and farther away from the solution.
The
And speaking specifically, I'm about to lose the point. I think I've lost it. It'll probably come back to me later. I'll let you go from that.
If I may kind of bounce off on that, the ironic thing is, and I discussed this in depth on the Thursday podcast. The ironic thing about this whole Me Too movement, and also kind of the sexual revolution, is the left likes to say that we were too Puritan before the sexual revolution, but and we'll talk about this in maybe a future podcast. But in my mind, the left has become even more puritanical than the religious right. Dennis Prager wrote a pretty interesting column, which I highlighted on the Thursday show, where I guess this feminist group now wants the NFL to get rid of their cheerleading squad because they find cheerleading squads within the NFL to be too sexualized and too demeaning to women. Never mind the fact that these are the same feminists who want to be able to post sexually explicit artwork on Instagram and whatnot. Also, never mind the fact that a lot of the NFL cheerleaders themselves do not see what they do as being objectifying. And in fact, if you talk to a lot of the NFL and college cheerleaders, they've gained lots of opportunities from being able to dance on the sidelines or whatever. So I just find this whole sexual revolution from the left to be quite ironic, kind of.
I'm glad you bring that up because you reminded me of the point I wanted to make. So they here's essentially the problem. Sin begets sin. Nothing good comes out of sin. Only God can make good results come out of evil. Only God can do that. We can't. And what happens, like I said before, they're running with the presumptions of the last failed sexual revolution to launch another one. So they're basically saying that sin was okay. We're just going to build onto it. Sin begets more sin. And so here's the thing. You often hear feminists say there was a double standard in the 1950s. A man could go around and have as much sex with as many women as he wanted, and that was fine. But a woman did that, and she was called a slut or whatever. And here's the thing, yeah, that was wrong. I'll admit that was wrong. That wasn't right then, and it wouldn't be right now. But that doesn't mean that you say, oh, the men are going around and sleeping with whoever they want and not getting in trouble for it. We should lower ourselves to that standard too. That seems to be what their answer is. And that's what the sexual revolution was. And we've seen how that turned out. That's what led to things like Harvey Weinstein. And the irony of it, as you mentioned earlier with the all men may be rapists thing, is that they've basically become a sort of a twisted reflection of what they said they were against. So, for example, before, the criticism of those of us who want a culture of modesty has always been, well, you should be able to control yourself. Just because you see a naked woman doesn't give you the right to rape her. And nobody ever said it did in the first place. I would say that is wrong. But what they've done is they basically flipped it around now and said that well, men are all, they can't control themselves. They're all rapists. They see us and they want to rape us. So you can kind of see how they've sort of become a twisted reflection of themselves. I think that sums it up pretty perfectly.
Yeah,
and you don't want to go off onto a tangent on this. I know we'll get into it more with Virginia because that's the whole issue I have with Fairfax. But plus, I think we're not even halfway through State of the Union. We're going to be in for a long show tonight.
Yeah. So one of the other, going back to State of the Union, one of the other things I found, I didn't talk about this a lot, and I don't think it bears a lot of discussion, but I will say, I think the fact that Trump brought up the Holocaust survivor and the World War II vet and did that whole thing. I think that was pretty good, obviously. However, the media is going to continue to label Trump as being quote unquote alt-right. They're going to continue lumping him in with the likes of Richard Spencer, despite the fact that Trump has, in my mind, been one of the most outspoken presidents against anti-Semitism that I can remember. It's kind of an ironic tragedy there.
I will say that I thought, and this goes maybe as a good segue into the foreign policy realm of things, but I thought that there was almost too much focus on that. I know that the ending attempt to drive home the unity point with World War II would have been good, except it seemed like he dragged it out for so long. About midway through, I was asking, what in God's name are we talking about? I've forgotten the plot. But
yeah, there was a hole there.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this is a good segue into foreign policy. My second big item from the State of the Union.
Oh boy.
Because for me, the focus there is almost, for all the, it's almost like even when it comes to foreign policy, evangelicalism has almost become the de facto state religion because it's used to justify our entire policy towards Israel. I've found it particularly humorous that at I'm going to butcher his name again, but the Guidao or however you pronounce his name, the opposition leader from Venezuela, at all of his events, they have American and Israeli flags there. And I'm always like, well, what in God's name does this have to do with what's going on in Venezuela? And you see it in South Korea, too. Just today, there was a protest by a group of South Koreans against Trump's tweets from last night or 2 nights ago, where he announced that he's going to be meeting with Kim Jong-un again, and he praised Kim Jong-un. But they had Israeli flags at the South Korean protest against Kim Jong-un, and I was just laughing because I was like, what in God's name does this have to do with the Korean Peninsula? But the Holocaust point, one of my major sticking points with the way he used that was that he basically told a blatant lie about Iran when he ran with the, and maybe I'm jumping around. Maybe if you guys had some more specific questions about the foreign policy, I might not do that. But he told a blatant lie about Iran, saying they wanted to finish the Holocaust and they wanted to kill all the Jews. But the third largest Jewish community in the world after the United States and Israel is Iran. There's a thriving Jewish community in Tehran. I shared it. Maybe I tagged you guys in it. In fact, the news clip reporting on them. Jews in Iran are not being murdered for their faith. They're allowed to practice their faith. It is a protected faith group. But even the very next morning, the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, tweeted about it, saying, we're going to continue our work with our Jewish compatriots, he said. So, and that was, I had a lot of issues. I said to a friend of mine during the foreign policy section, and I'll let you guys take it from here, that I was getting ready to have an aneurysm. And the thing that was so sad about it was it followed right after abortion, because I was mid-sentence. I kid you not. He was finishing up on abortion, and he was saying that all children are made in God's image, and I agreed with him completely. And right as he was getting ready to transition, I was mid-sentence saying to a friend of mine, "This is the best part of the speech." Oh no, he's going into foreign policy, and it was exactly like that. And I'll let you guys sort of follow up with your thoughts from there, or maybe your questions or whatever.
Well, first off, I was gonna make a joke, about how obviously, Josh, there are a bunch of Jews in the Korean Peninsula. There are a ton of Jews there, so that's why there was the Israeli flag and
Well,
whatnot.
the actual reason behind that, because I actually, that was what finally was too much for me, because I had been seeing them in Venezuela, and and then I started seeing them at these South Korean protests, and I finally was like, screw it, I need to know what the rationale behind this is. And in both cases, it was evangelical groups who are convinced that they need to align with the United States because the United States government, especially under Trump, has taken such a solidly Zionist position. And this is a tangent for a whole other episode, but it just blows my mind because only in America, or rather, I should say, because apparently their missionaries have spread it there. Only in evangelical circles is Israel upheld as this prophetic end times event. Because if you look at the Catholic and the Orthodox churches that comprise most of the Christian population in the world, the attitude towards the references to Israel, and I'm speaking more for the Catholic faith than the Orthodox, the reference towards Israel in the book of Revelation is that it's the church, not that it is the geopolitical entity known as the state of Israel. And the fact is that Palestinian Christians in Israel are persecuted because of their race, because of who they are. They aren't protected because they are Christians. The fact is, when it comes to Christians in the Middle East, the Syrian and Iranian governments do a better job protecting them than the Israeli government does. But that's a tangent for a whole nother episode.
I I will say, Josh, that I've had a couple. I actually do have a few listeners of the podcast from Israel, and one of them actually DM'd me on Twitter and was saying that Americans are more that like Americans and specifically like American neoconservatives, it seems, are more obsessed with this whole we need to Israel is our greatest ally, you
Well,
know, and
it's the American Conservative, which you guys know I love to read. They had an article out the night, either an hour after the speech or the day after, and it was called "The Irrational Iran Obsession," and it talked about that because what reasons does the United States have to continue this obsession with Iran? They haven't attacked us. They're supposedly, this is the other issue I took with the speech. They're supposedly, according to our government anyway, the world's leading state sponsor of terror. But the fact is, and I'll try and break it down as briefly as possible, that Iran, there are only two organizations that you can say are, that you can make an argument for, I should say, that are supposedly terrorist organizations that Iran backs. Hezbollah, which the U.S. State Department has not classified as a terrorist organization since 2015, and which has never attacked the United States, and which has never attacked any country besides Israel, and Hamas, which, like Hezbollah, has never attacked any country besides Israel. And in Hezbollah's case, they're actually a Lebanese political party with an armed branch that protects the Christians in Lebanon. I've shared with you guys before an article from Crooks, which is a Catholic publication, talking about how Lebanon is the place where Western stereotypes about Middle Eastern Christians go to die. But those are the only two organizations that you can make the case for Iran backing, that you can attempt to make an argument are terrorist organizations. But again, they've only ever attacked one country. If you look at the organizations that Saudi Arabia has backed, the Wahhabi Salafist Islamic organizations like ISIS, Al Nusra, Al Shabaab, and Al Qaeda, they have records attacking multiple countries across the globe and multiple nationalities, including America. And they are funded. They're all a radical, I would say, bastardization of Sunni Islam, Wahhabism. But there are no major Shiite groups. The only one I can think of would be Hezbollah, and it's not really a terrorist organization. Hamas is majority Sunni, but there is no. Think about it. There's no reason for America to be so irrationally obsessed with Iran, except for the fact that Iran and Israel have incredibly negative relations between one another.
Yeah,
Well, I mean,
like,
I will
go
say, I
ahead,
mean,
Joey. Go ahead,
it,
Gabe.
it's not. I mean, it's not super surprising, that portion of the speech. I mean, Trump has been pretty much. Um, I mean, other than just rhetoric, Trump has been pretty consistently a traditional Republican conservative on foreign policy. I mean, he's said a lot of things that have riled certain conservative circles, but he hasn't done anything on it. So I mean, you can look at it and go, it's not rational, the obsession with Iran. And I think to an extent that's true, but neither is the irrational obsession with Democrats with Russia. I mean, partly it's a creation of partisanship in terms of Republicans don't like Iran because Obama made a deal with Iran and we have to undo the deal that Obama made. By the same token, it's Democrats now suddenly focusing on Russia because supposedly Trump has dealings with Russia. So it's not, I mean, it's not necessary. It's not just the geopolitical relationship. It's also just the partisan relationship and the parties basically just finding something to define as their boogeyman and to focus on.
I think.
I mean, I will say I wasn't surprised that Trump spent a significant portion of his speech on Iran, while he didn't talk about the fact that Saudi Arabia was basically bombing a bunch of women and children in Yemen. You kind of, I mean, if you know politics at all, you kind of just know that that's going to happen. And it doesn't make it right. And I'm not saying that people don't have a right to complain about it, but it honestly is one of those things that I personally just expected to see and saw.
I think that's a really good take, and I want to thank you for reminding me to actually praise him on something, because I haven't done that. Because while I was upset on a lot of the foreign policy, there were a few good things. The diatribe against endless war that he kept bringing up, I thought was really good, and I'm just disappointed that it's not been more consistently applied, because he has taken really good steps on Syria and Afghanistan. And as an update for our listeners, it seems like the jury is still out on Syria, because as of
Yeah.
today, I saw that there were signs that they've already set a date for when we're going to completely withdraw, even though Pompeo and Bolton are trying their damnedest to stop it. So we'll see where that goes. Hopefully, the bureaucracy fails at preventing this. But so he has taken good steps on countries like on withdrawing from Syria and Afghanistan. It's just that it's not been consistently applied, like I said. So during the speech, I praised him for that, but I was deeply disappointed when it came to the bashing on Iran, and then the push for more intervention in Venezuela, which I think, as we've discussed last week, I was pretty solidly against.
I would have to agree with that on both points. I was actually looking at stuff regarding uh I forget the governor's name, the blackface.
Governor
Oh,
Northam.
Yeah.
Ralph Northam.
Yeah, are we gonna bring that up at all?
I think I'm done with my big 2 points on the State of the Union. So unless you guys have something, I'm game for moving into it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. Did Trump specifically? So did Trump specifically mention Virginia, or did he mention New York?
He specifically mentioned New York.
Okay.
He he did sort of allude to it though, with the comments about there being baby killers because that was more Northam than New York. Because he was the one who said that he would have
He
been fine
he
with the child having been born and then them letting it die anyway.
he actually did.
Well, and then I think that tied into there was a bill that was introduced into a House committee in Virginia. Um, and I think I wrote an article on this where the Democratic legislator who introduced the bill, she was asked by a member of the committee whether her bill would allow abortions up to the baby being born, and the legislator said yes.
Yeah,
The,
I saw that too. I would just say I even though it's becoming more noticed now, it's really not a new position for the Democrats because I
no,
remember I can't think of the specifics of the bill, but I remember a very good friend of mine, who was also my speech coach back in high school, talked about this with me, and he said that that was the reason he could never, even if he did like Obama on certain things, the reason he could never vote for Barack Obama was because when Barack Obama was in the Senate, he voted yes for a bill that I forget what the reasoning would have been, but essentially what it would have done, if I'm remembering correctly, what this friend of mine said to me, is that it would have allowed for, let's say, the baby was born prematurely or something like that. They rule it as chemical waste and then stick it in a bag and basically let it die in another room before they dispose of it. And then Senator Obama voted yes for this, I guess, and that was what this friend of mine told me why they could never, even if they liked Obama on some things, they could never vote for him. So this isn't really new for the Democratic Party. They're just becoming much more vocal about it.
well, it does speak to whether. I mean, I think it speaks to Democrats are jumping ahead of themselves in terms of what people are going to tolerate. I mean, one of the things that I think has made the religious right lose the battle over issues like abortion and gay marriage is that they've refused to either moderate or and I know these are issues that if you believe in, you don't want to moderate, but by the same token, so for example, if you believe life begins at conception, you believe abortion should be banned, period. End of story. But by the same token, if you believe abortion is a woman's right to choose, then you don't care if a baby is aborted at 9 months, because until that baby comes out of the womb, it is still the woman's right to choose what she wants to do it. The thing is, there's a lot of people who are not that invested in the issue,
There,
see the gray area that's involved there. And so when suddenly Democrats win an election with people who they think are the educated kind of people that are going to buy into their argument, they start walking around spouting, oh, well, yeah, we should be able to abort a baby up to 9 months. Those same people are going to go, well, that's as extreme as the other side. And that's where I think this backlash against Democrats is starting to come from.
I think that's a good way to put it because I know a few people who are they support what they consider to be because I've gotten in debates with these people. They'll say, "Well, I'm not pro-abortion, I'm pro-choice," and they say that with good faith. These are people who say that with good faith because in their eyes they view it as something to the effect of, well, we can't force a woman to take on the economic burden of a child or whatever, and that's how they view it. They view it in a purely economic, non. They don't really consider the life of the child, I would say. But my counter to that would be is even if you are not, even if you consider yourself pro-choice because you think people should just have the choice, even if that is your position, when it comes to abortion in practice, it's not really pro-choice though, because and I think I've brought this up on our program before. If you're a rich woman from New York, you are unless you are really just against having a kid, which you have a lot bigger problems than this, I think. Um, But if you're a rich woman from New York, you're not the kind of person who is pushed into doing that. It is poor women. It is women of color. The majority of children that are aborted are black and non-white. It's not a choice. It's preying on the most vulnerable, and they are the ones who have to sacrifice their children up to Moloch, if you will, not some rich woman from New York. So it's not really about choice at the end of the day, because what choice is that to somebody who is poor? And while we're on it, if we're really discussing it from the angle of people need to have a choice, then how come adoption is never raised as a legitimate choice? How come they always seem to shy away from that, the people who say that? So I see where you're coming from. I think there are
And
people who say that in good faith, but they really haven't thought the issue out, and they're not viewing it from the full spectrum, is what I would say.
I can actually tell you that one of the reasons why the why they say adoption is never considered an option, and it's extremely cynical, if I do say so myself. And this is I'm speaking as someone who, uh, as I grow older, unfortunately, I've become more and more cynical of some people, but I'm not this cynical. The argument against, well, I shouldn't say against adoption, but why adoption is really brought up is the left say, well, the vast majority of adoptions are of black or minority children, and very few white families want to adopt black or Hispanic children. They only want healthy white babies. Okay, so in essence, we're justifying we're justifying one form of racism, um, which is killing minority babies in the womb, to oppose another form of racism, uh, which I don't even think really exists, which is this whole notion that white people don't want to adopt minority babies, which is laughable because
Well,
I know
well,
lots of
I think it's as laughable as the belief that white people don't want to marry black people, or white people don't want to marry Asians, or Hispanics
exactly.
don't want to marry
I'll
white
tell
people.
you, I'll put that argument to rest right now, because actual science, it is scientifically proven. It is scientifically proven that we are attracted to people who are often from a different ethnic background than us. And that is because, at an evolutionary level, you want
Ugh.
your offspring to have the best chance at survival, right? So,
Mhm.
you may not consciously realize it, but we pick up on pheromones other people have, and we try and find mates that have immune systems that are as different as possible from us. So, if you look, for example, at the Native Americans, I'll use that as an example because the Catholic Church, we encouraged back in those days, we encouraged our people to marry and have children with the Indians because it increases the chance of survival for them. And the reason is, if you are from an area that has a certain climate and has certain diseases that you're more vulnerable to, your immune system is going to be programmed to work that way. If you're from a different continent with different climate and different potential illnesses that your immune system has to be prepared to fight against, and you come to this other place and you have children with that person, your offspring is going to have an immune system that is stronger than either of the parents. And so that is the notion of pure race is incredibly stupid to me, because if you had a pure race, it would probably die out incredibly quickly, because you wouldn't have. Well, I mean, think about it. Think about it. You laugh, but think about it. This is the science.
No, I'm not laughing. You think, well, Josh, when you think about it, look at all the think about like European or like British history, and how the nobles would interbreed with each other and they would struggle to have offspring. That's exactly it. You limit your genetic diversity. Therefore, what do you expect to happen? You're going to not be able to have offspring, or the offspring that you have are going to be physically unfit. So I mean, from a biological perspective, yeah, you seek out mates that are different than you because of that genetic diversity.
Exactly. So that was sort of a tangent, I guess. I don't know how we got onto that, but to your point though, Sam, exactly on the. I've got friends. I've mentioned them several times on this podcast. They're decent people aside from their politics, and they're hyper liberal. But as our listeners may know, Sam and I are both into vintage menswear, and I do business with these people because they sell vintage menswear. And but they're far out there to the left, especially the wife in terms of how pro-abortion she is, and she has twisted herself into a pretzel trying to explain to me how abortion is necessary in order to counter white supremacy. And I'm sitting here thinking the majority of children that are aborted, the majority of murdered children in this country are black. How can you make the case that by allowing those black children to be murdered, you are somehow fighting against white supremacy? It just doesn't add up. But they've got this intersectionality thing going. And I'm not even going to try and quote what her argument is because I could barely follow it. It was some sort of long labyrinth, some sort of the kind of, you've twisted yourself into a pretzel thing that you see at universities these days.
Okay, Josh, to your point, I want to bring something up because Jolly Roger in our YouTube chat, and forgive me, Jolly, I don't know how long you've been watching, but forgive me for not pulling up the live chat sooner. He just DM'd me on our Discord. Genetic diversity based on immune systems. Did he address sickle cell yet? Yeah, that's a good point. You know, sickle. I guess you know, genetic diversity helps combat against sickle cell anemia. I guess.
Oh, sickle cell anemia. Okay. Um, I mean, I would suppose so. The general principle I was to sort of go back to that. The general principle essentially is this: that if you and people have their own different preferences, and when it comes to selecting a mate, there are both conscious decisions we make, and there are subconscious things, and that's not just finding somebody to marry and have children with. That's something that we do every day and everything in our life. But subconsciously, we may not realize that we're doing it for those reasons, but subconsciously, our bodies try to detect through pheromones people who have immune systems that are different from us. And as often the case, people from different ethnic backgrounds are going to be probably, in terms of immune systems, those who are most different from our own. And so that's to my point. That's what I was trying to say when I said the notion of a pure race is silly and stupid, because you would be, as Gabe noted with the Royals in Europe, your offspring would, over time, as generations went by, would be more and more vulnerable to different types of diseases, and we've seen this. They don't, disease doesn't stop at the border; it moves, and through shipping, through business, you can't limit it just by restricting immigration. It's going to keep on moving if you ship materials. Even a lot of the times, rats, or that's how the Black Plague got into Europe, through animals. But anyways, sort of going off onto a tangent there. The point is that that's why the notion of a pure race is stupid, because over time those generations will be more vulnerable to different diseases because they're not getting the different sort of immune setup, if you will. I'm not a geneticist, so I don't know what the term would be.
Yeah.
But you increase your chances. Maybe Gabe knows the term I'm looking for here. Maybe you have a better idea. But you increase your chances with somebody whose immune system is as different as possible from yours, because your offspring has both the benefits of your immune system plus your mates. That's as simple as I can make it, I guess.
Well, I forget what the exact term is, but yeah, essentially that's what it is. But I mean, tying this back to Virginia or New York, I think it just speaks to. I do think it speaks to, or actually tying it back to a prior point that you made, Josh, which is that the friends that you have that are pro-choice, who are well-meaning, and I have them too, um, they also are enabling this kind of thing to happen. And by essentially enabling this thing to happen, why are they shocked when suddenly you hear somebody spout, "Well, you should be able to abort a baby at 9 months"? What did you think was going to happen when you enable people to be able to abort a baby at 6 months? It's just a logical progress. It's just a logical progression of that it is a woman's right to choose, and until that baby comes out of the woman, it's still the woman's right to choose what happens to it. So I mean, I think there's a double standard when everybody is apoplectic at Northam saying that after the baby is born, the doctor and the mother will have a conversation. Well, that's the next logical progression once they start legalizing, making it as easy as possible to get abortions, and you don't need any qualifications to conduct an abortion.
Here, I'm glad. I like how you phrased that. How where do you draw the line if you've gone for 6 months and then that's just the progression, because essentially, and we've this. I've said that our podcast could probably also be called something along the lines of philosophical discussions, because we've discussed before on here the ultimate problem with all this is that people have fundamentally different worldviews now. I forget the name of the cardinal who said it, but there's a Catholic cardinal who put it this way once, and I only recently discovered this quote. But he said that all conflicts in human history are essentially theological in nature. And what he's essentially saying is, it depends on how you view the nature of man, who God is, who man is. And so if you're coming at it from this Enlightenment liberal angle that man is sovereign and that the individual is sovereign and that nothing can limit him and that he knows what is best and he can do whatever he wants so long as he is, in theory, not harming somebody else, then you inevitably get to the point where you're willing to say, yeah, sure, we can abort a baby after it's been born. Or, yeah, sure, I can change myself into a parakeet and say that I'm a female and that I'm a orangutan with pink and purple polka dots or whatever, because you completely undermine what it means to be a human being. And that's what really the core of all of our debates are anymore, because whether it's defining when life begins or trying to determine if there's only two genders as we have always understood it, as science has always understood it, or if people can just be whatever they want to be, the physical evidence be damned. It all comes back ultimately to what is man or what is a human being. And it's essentially a theological debate, even if our society doesn't want to accept it as one, because we sort of have taken ourselves to be gods. I also teach CCD, and I recently was explaining this to my students. And for our listeners who don't know what CCD is, that is a program within the Catholic Church for young students. I teach 7th through 8th grade to help them learn the faith, and I'm a teacher for that. And so, anyways, I was recently discussing this with my students, saying that a lot of the problems your guys' generation is seeing growing up, specifically the transgender stuff, goes all the way back. It's the same initial lie that Satan told Adam and Eve in the garden, when he said to them that if you eat from the tree of knowledge, if you eat from the tree of good and evil, you can be just like God. And that's essentially what the Enlightenment is, what this current cultural underpinning that so much of our society has come to accept essentially says that man is God, man is sovereign, man can do what he wants, he has no responsibilities to anyone but himself. And that's the faulty underpinning, that's ultimately at the root of all these things. I'd be interested in hearing Gabe's come back to that, because I know you and I have interesting discussions on this.
Well, I'll admit I sort of zoned out in there for a second. Sorry.
Oh, it's all right. I sometimes have that effect.
No, it's not you. I mean, well, yeah, it's not you. I think I just zoned out there for a second. I fully admit. I mean, I'll go back to what I said before, which is I do just think that it is a logical progression of what we're going to see in society in terms of things such as abortion. But I personally am a bit shocked and offended by that the media has enabled this to occur, and then they're supposedly shocked and offended when essentially the fruits of their labor are shown so clearly. And again, it goes back to the what did you expect? Like again, you allow abortion at 6 months. What's the difference between 6 and 9 months? At 6 months, it's been science has proven that a baby can feel, it can move. So what's the difference between 6 months and 9 months, other than a number to people? If you believe that abortion should be allowed at 6 months, um, I mean, essentially the entire Virginia thing boils down to it insults people's sensibilities. And I mean, I hate to tie this to sort of how African Americans feel about racism, in that white suburbanites will vote for people who are well sounding and who talk about how we need to eliminate racism, but they aren't willing to get their hands dirty to actually stop it. And by the same token, I think this is the perfect corollary to that, in terms of that you're the white suburbanite or the suburbanite in general is fine with abortion at 6 months, as long as it gives the woman the right to pursue, say, her economic dreams. But at 9 months, they're offended by it. Well, an abortion is an abortion at 6 months. At 6 months versus 9 months, and the baby still feels it at 6 months versus 9 months. So really, it's splitting hairs.
For,
Um,
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but their whole starting argument almost made this inevitable too. But if I'm not wrong in saying this, I don't think. Correct me if I am. But from the get go, hasn't their argument essentially been that until it's born, it's not really a human being? Isn't that
Pretty
what they
much,
always said? So
yeah.
that sets them up for this mentality, because if it's not a human being, then yeah, what difference does it make from 6 to 8 months?
Well,
So
and if you ultimately believe, I mean, fundamentally believe that a woman's body, anything that happens to a woman's body or anything that occurs within a woman's body is ultimately her property and it's her right to choose, then a baby at 6 months or a baby at 9 months, as long as it's not out of the womb, ultimately, why would you care what happens to that baby? I mean, that again is just the ultimate progression of that line of thought, which which is she can do whatever she wants with it. I mean, to them it's an it. To them it's not a living thing.
Exactly,
So,
exactly,
and
Gabe.
I think, I mean, I do appreciate, I mean, bringing this back to the State of the Union for a second, that Trump actually did bring that up. And I know that was probably the most contentious point of the State of the Union, but I think it was a point he had to make, not just because of the moral implications of it, but also I think he had to make it because his reelection prospects somewhat hinge on it. I mean, it's now out there, black and white, that there are states that are basically saying it's okay to make abortion as easy to get as buying a Big Mac at Burger King. I mean, that fundamentally is essentially where some states are going.
Gabe, I'm gonna have to correct you on this one, because I think it'd be pretty difficult to buy a Big Mac at a Burger King.
Oh,
Uh,
did I get that one wrong? Oh, I meant to say Whopper.
Yeah, a Whopper at a Burger King.
no, no, Josh. I'm gonna have to correct you on that one. I'm gonna have to correct both of you on this one, because now, at least in New York City, I'm pretty sure it's harder. I'm pretty sure it's actually harder to buy a Big Mac at McDonald's or a Whopper at Burger King in like New York City than it is to get an abortion. Like, and that's what's so insane. This is why I want to go to New York. It is now harder to go to a fast food restaurant and order like a burger and fries because of De Blasio's stupid health laws than it is to abort a baby. That's the weird thing is, God forbid, we're God forbid we kill ourselves with fast food and burgers and fries. Oh no, we can't have that. But by all means, these women can kill their children, literally a few weeks before they're born if they want to.
It gets even crazier with the Green New Deal because by God, we can't be
Oh,
eating hamburgers and killing these cows, but we can. Uh,
oh God, Josh, I was hoping to make it through a podcast without you mentioning the Green New Deal. Fuck, why'd you have to do that, man?
no, I'm sure we'll do a special episode all on just that eventually. But
I was going to
Oh,
say that would be its own podcast right there.
oh yeah. I
well,
don't I don't mean to curse at you. It's just, I mean, good God Almighty.
the
If people didn't think Ocasio Cortez was an idiot before, if it wasn't painfully obvious, even I read an article last night. I tweeted this out a few days ago, just with like me laughing and saying ha 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 ha, uh, but
I wanted to
e-
support this thing. I wanted to support it.
uh,
I'm literally the guy sitting here saying, "Look, Ocasio, you only had one job. You just had to write a bill that would have adequately addressed climate change. And instead, you come out with a bill that includes
uh,
protections for 35 or whatever the heck the number was. 35 protections for quote unquote historically oppressed classes of Americans.
well,
You had one job. I was rooting for you on this one, and you screwed it up. But
she went from sustainable green energy to basically a whole plan for like a one world government and total globalism. And even Nancy Pelosi was like, "Yeah, I'm not Alex Jones, but even all of this seems a little extreme
I, I
for
will say
me."
the crowning moment of stupidity in that has to be the living wage for those who are unwilling to work. Uh, which like
They already have that. It's called welfare.
but well, they do have requirements on some of that. I am all for helping. As you have listened, if you're a regular listener of our podcast, you know that out of all of our hosts here, I am the one that is sternly almost to the left on economic issues, and even I will come out and say that that's insane. Uh,
Yeah.
argue that
Uh, Again, this is why I'm so disappointed that my sound effect board didn't didn't isn't working with Hangouts. I had so many good ones I could have played for this point. But yeah,
while we're discussing Virginia, excuse me there. While we're discussing Virginia, we've sort of discussed Northam. I was wondering if we could visit the facts about the Fairfax case because I know I was kind of excited to discuss that.
yeah, Josh. To be honest, I don't really know that much about Fairfax, so fill me in, or both of you.
I don't think anyone knows really that much about Fairfax. So he is the African American lieutenant governor of Virginia, and
Oh yeah.
and
Okay,
he
yeah.
he was the next in line to and I bring up his race because there's a funny joke I want to tell about that I saw on Catholic Twitter earlier this morning. But he was in line to take over after Northam until his own scandal came out. But I'll quickly tell you the joke. I forget who it was, but somebody tweeted that I don't think the Democrats have really thought out this whole the way they're handling Virginia because in a scandal about a guy wearing blackface, it's starting to look like the white guys will get off with it while the black guy is the one who takes the hit. Because that's who the media, they're like, I don't think we've thought the implications of this out too far because it looks like the black guy is the only one who gets in trouble in a scandal about a white governor being in blackface. But that was the joke. But, anyways, he was in line to take over after Northam. And that's sort of been jeopardized for him now because a woman came forward saying that she had previously, and I will lay out my theory of what happened after I explain, but that had previously worked with him said that he basically forced her to give him oral sex. And another allegation has come forward, although I don't really know the details on that one. Maybe Gabe can bring those in later. So I'm not going to address those so much. I'm going to discuss the initial claim against him. But she claims that her and Fairfax were working at the state capitol one night, and they kind of had the hots for each other, so they were making out. But apparently, after they had made out for a little while, he forced her to perform oral sex on him. Which I don't know if our listeners are familiar with how the mechanics of that work. And I'm not really going to explain it, but suffice it to say, I don't quite understand. If a man were trying to force that onto you, I would think you could bite. Um, so that's my first problem with it. But here's what I think ultimately happened, and here's why I think this is so problematic, and why I stick up for him. Because I do believe he's innocent and deserves the benefit of the doubt until he is convicted in a court of law. But here's the thing. According to her, they were making out in the state capitol one night. Okay, not very professional, but you can see that was consensual and they had the hots for each other. Now, here's where my theory comes in. So we've established they're kind of into each other and they're making out. What I think probably happened is he wanted her to perform oral sex on him, and he sort of pressured her into it. And if
Yeah.
I think every woman, unfortunately, in America knows or has been in a situation like this, particularly when they're in high school, where a boyfriend tried to pressure them into doing something sexual they didn't want to do, and the usual argument would be, well, if you love me, you'll do it, or that's what boyfriends and girlfriends are supposed to do, or whatever. And that's unfortunate, and that's terrible, and that's tragic, and that's what we really should be having a discussion about. But instead, we're in the throes of the Me Too thing, so we're not. And what probably happened was he pressured her into doing it. She consented reluctantly, reluctantly being the key word, because she still consented. Even if here's my issue with it. If we're gonna go, we should call if he did pressure her into doing that, we should call him out on that. Just like we should call out all the men who have pressured women into doing things like that, and we should call out all the women who have pressured men into doing things like that, because that happens in the reverse as well. That is wrong, but we're not discussing that. Instead, what our society seems to be doing is saying, "Oh, look, that is the same thing as a rape," but it isn't. It's not the same thing. The consent was still there. I think we do a huge disservice to young people who are already confused enough about this, as everything's in flux. It seems like we do a huge disservice to them by blurring the already increasingly blurry lines on what our culture deems consent, by blurring them even further, because consenting reluctantly is different than being forced, like physically forced, like at gunpoint, into doing something. And I think anybody with some common sense could see that. And I'll let you guys take it from here, because I've laid out my theory. I've laid out what I think is wrong with it. I think that we're going back and turning something that was already wrong, and we're making it like a capital offense. We're saying, "Oh, he's a rapist." Well, he's not a rapist. He's a jerk and a jackass. If my theory is correct, but that's not the same as being a rapist. So
Again, this goes back to my whole thing the the double standard that the Me Too movement has, and whatnot, and how they've become the new sexual Puritans. Okay, we've seen time and time again examples of uh, women being encouraged and you know uh, yeah, of being allowed and even encouraged to dress or uh, act in a obviously sexually provocative way, and yet these feminists are saying almost as kind of a joke, I would say, that just because a woman does sexual behavior does not necessarily mean that it's intended sexually, even though we damn well know that that's what it is. So then if a man is is titillated by a woman, well, then he's an inherent rapist. Now, the reason why I bring that up with this whole Fairfax thing is we don't know what it. I hate to be this guy, but we don't know, what happened. We only know what allegedly happened. Um, you know, for all intents and purposes, they could have started making out, and yeah, like you said, Josh, it could have been reluctant. Uh, at the same time, though, she could have also, liked the idea of performing oral sex, and then like found it disappointing or whatever, and then decided that it was sexual assault or something. That happens a lot too,
That
where
does.
uh,
That does.
women are really into the prospect of, performing whatever sexual act, and then they get done and they find, oh, it's not that fulfilling, so I'm going to, cry rape or something. It happens all the time on college campuses too.
So
So,
many of these problems, and this is my number. If you're a young teenager, or kind of in that position, or you're somebody who's just not engaged in sexual relations yet, my advice to you is this: just keep your pants zipped until you are married. It will save you so many problems.
Yeah.
yep.
And that's just the thing, because as I've sort of harped on throughout this whole podcast about man having this post enlightenment view, the same lie that Satan offered back in the Garden of Eden, thinking that we can be as God and that we can know what's best and that we're in control of everything and that we know what's best, is disproven, hilariously disproven, by the fact that advice going back over 2,000 years ago, the advice of simply waiting to have sex until you're married, can solve like 99% of the sexual problems that our society has. And it just goes to show you that modern society, we don't know what's best. We're not God. We're not geniuses just because we were able to land on the moon. Which, if you're Alex Jones, you debate that to begin with. Uh,
Or
uh,
if you're Owen Benjamin. So
yeah, or if you're Owen Benjamin, but it's old advice that could perfectly solve so many of these. To me, I call them unnecessary problems of modern living. It is what it is. I guess that's what I'll have to say about
all, all, all I could say for the young gentleman listening out there is just continue to dress sharp and be a gentleman, but wait until you're married. There's nothing wrong with being a gentleman, but just leave it at that. So
I will gladly say for our viewers, in case you feel the peer pressure, I have waited until I am married, and I am not yet married. So
not neither am I. In fact, my poor mother keeps harping on me. When are you gonna date? When are you gonna find a nice girl and settle down and get married? So, and I've actually told her, this is the other thing too. I've said, Mom, it's hard because so many of these women, not all of them, but a lot of them are just they're still caught up in their own heads, and wanting to. None of them are ready to settle down, and I want to find a woman who I'm proud to bring home to you. So
Well, I mean,
yeah.
I think it does point. I think it does point to that, as you say, Josh. It is really easy to see how these things can be misunderstood. I will say for Fairfax, it does it doesn't sound like the first allegation was as serious. The second allegation is much more in terms of the testimony, and I forget her name. She did make it public, but the testimony that the second allegation or the second person alleges is much more sexual assault than the first allegation.
can
Um,
you fill us in on that? Because I sort of mentioned that at the beginning. I have not had a chance to really read into the second one yet, so I'm still kind of sailing blind on this one.
I haven't read that much into it either, other than that I do know that the allegation that she did put out is much in terms of what she alleges. It pretty much is that he raped her and that it was premeditated and it wasn't a misunderstanding, as opposed to the first allegation of, well, he forced me to perform oral sex. Well, that's a lot different than a premeditated rape, and that's what the second allegation pretty much alleges. I mean, I don't know much more than that, but the second allegation is much more serious than the first in terms of if it's true, it pretty much is rape. I mean, there's no room for misinterpretation in that regard.
Gotcha. I'll have to, yeah, we'll have to maybe revisit this after we get a chance to read more about it and see if anybody else comes forward or what happens, because this is still involving Virginia is a slow moving train wreck because for our listeners who aren't familiar, the governor was first in hot water for his comments on essentially saying that a baby can be born and that they can choose to let it die and essentially abort it after it's been born afterwards. Then the lieutenant governor had the cases we just discussed about sexual assault and impropriety on his part, and then the Republican speaker of the I forget if it's the House or the Senate. There, he was the third in line for the secession after the lieutenant governor. He came out and said that he had pictures of himself in blackface when he was in high school. And to his credit, I guess he decided to come right out and admit it. But it's just a train wreck in Virginia.
You have that slightly backwards. So the Republican Senate Majority Leader is the one who supposedly said that there's a picture of that he was putting the yearbook together of his part of the team that put together the yearbook for his high school that posted those photos. He is not the fourth in line. That's the Speaker of the House. However, the Senate Majority Leader has been around for a really damn long time, and so it's pretty shocking there too. But he would not be in line for the governorship if all three Democrats resign. It would be the Speaker. But again, it's another sign of the train wreck that is the grand state of Virginia.
Well, if you feel bad about how you do your job, just imagine how the Virginia Republican Party opposition research guys must be feeling, because this wasn't even stuff that was like hidden in some big conspiracy. It was just a picture in the guy's yearbook. Anybody should have been able to find that.
Well,
admittedly, I guess a yearbook might not be the first place you'd go looking for the damning evidence against your opponent in an election. But
well, I mean, I'm sure it's fresh in your guys' minds, the whole Kavanaugh hearing, but there are now one of the things that is going to be the consequences of the Kavanaugh hearing is opposition researchers are going to go into people's lives from when they were kids. So like I think a lot of Oppo researchers probably don't go back beyond when somebody enters politics. That's going to completely change now. They're going to go into a Facebook post you made when you were 10 years old that was like, I really wish I was Michael Jackson and dressed like a black person. That is probably what we're going to see in the future. And it's going to be unearthed after some guy wins the presidency 20 years from now.
I'm somewhat concerned about this, but my opinion on it has sort of evolved, because for the longest time, my attitude was this: millennials don't have to worry about this because everybody will have a Facebook and everybody will be able to relate to that kind of thing being out there. So I thought that those attacks would be less common. But then as this thing began to sort of began to gather steam, I began to really get worried about it. And so I think Rod Dreher put it the best on Twitter. He's a writer with the American Conservative. But from a Christian standpoint, as a society, I think we need to develop some sort of mechanism for grace for people going forward on stuff like this, because like I said, every millennial, and I don't know about the next generation. I don't think the younger kids are quite as into Facebook as we are, but they have their own versions like Instagram and stuff where that kind of thing can happen. Um, and what's going to happen to them going forward? We have to at some level as a society regain our sense of mercy or grace. Because think about it, what fair society is going to look at you like they did Kavanaugh and say, "Aha, you did stupid things when you were 12 years old. We're going to hold that against you for the rest of your life, Sonny." I mean, it's just ridiculous. I don't see how a functional society can do that indefinitely, because you'll get to a point where you'll either numb everybody to the point that when things that really are concerning show up, nobody's going to care, or you're going to get to this dystopian sort of future where only those who have access to that data, like the Zuckerbergs of the world, are safe, while everybody else is easily blackmailed.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. It basically it's a personification of your life is on public display for every single person, and it ties into the I mean, not to sidetrack us, but it ties into the whole debate over Democrats. Well, not debate, but Democrats basically probing into Trump's tax returns. Of you're opening Pandora's box in terms of that, just like you're opening up Pandora's box when you dig into somebody's history from 40 years ago, because whatever you do, the other side can do just as well.
I don't think so much about the tax returns, because that's been fairly common practice since Watergate. I thought that every candidate was supposed to release that kind of information.
Well, it yes and no. Not every candidate usually does, but not or every candidate usually does, or every candidate, I should say, every candidate usually does, but not every candidate is required to.
Gotcha. My whole theory on that has been that the only reason, because I think they're looking for some sort of aha. He had business dealings in Russia, which, as we've discussed before, who hasn't at that level, and my whole theory for why he's never released the tax returns is that he's just not as rich as he says he is. Which, again, maybe that'll be the case, and they'll try and turn that into a big scandal too. Like, he's not as wealthy as he says he is. To which I say, welcome to the statistics that show that on online dating, people are likely to boost their income potential by like 20% or whatever the figure is. But I mean, so. Not saying that's right either. It's just, we know it's a fact. People do that. So I don't see how that would be a big scandal for them if they found that in his. I think I think on the subject, kind of, and this could be another topic for itself. This last week, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church actually came out, and he gave a really good lecture on smartphones, where he basically said that if you're going to have this kind of technology, you need to make sure it's as decentralized as possible, because you risk catastrophe. We risk catastrophe, not just as on a country by country level, but as a species. We risk catastrophe if we allow there to be some sort of central database of everybody's data that only a small group of people get to have control of, which is kind of what has happened to a certain degree with Zuckerberg and Bezos and Apple and you name it. But
yeah. So, last part of our segment, which is Louisiana, and just for our readers, well, I should ask: do either of you guys really know that much about Louisiana?
I'll be honest, I haven't followed it too terribly closely. I saw the headlines like 2 days ago, and my extent of being able to inform myself about it has been my asking you earlier today. What about Louisiana? Uh,
Well, I mean, there's not a whole lot to it. I mean, other than so, you guys know the case from a few years ago where Texas tried to implement abortion restrictions, and Kennedy, when he was on the Supreme Court, basically ruled that those restrictions were unconstitutional. So Louisiana is among a couple other states, excuse me, in the South have passed abortion restrictions pretty similar to Texas's rules, that would force most of the abortion clinics in the state to close down. So it went to the appeals court, and I forget the exact appeals court that oversees that region. It's like the fifth or sixth appeals court, or circuit court, excuse me. And so the circuit court actually ruled in favor of the state of Louisiana. And so Planned Parenthood, in a last ditch effort, asked the Supreme Court to issue a stay. And on Friday, the Supreme Court issued the stay, basically saying the law can't be enforced until it moves through the rest of the judicial system and the Supreme Court decides whether to take up the case or not. It probably won't be heard this term. It'll probably be heard next term. But I think it does. I think in its own way, it puts to lie the idea that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. Because if Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned, the Supreme Court would not have issued a stay on this law.
Right.
So that's Louisiana. And Josh, I know you've been up in arms about this, about Republicans promising wins on the court and never getting anything for social conservatives, and that kind of feeds into it. Although I would issue the caution for our readers or our listeners, which is the Supreme Court issues lots of stays on many things. It doesn't necessarily indicate the opinions of the Supreme Court. It usually indicates that there's a split among the circuit courts, and so the Supreme Court is issuing a stay just to keep things as is until it goes to the Supreme Court for an actual decision. So, I mean, you can read into the tea leaves of this or not, but it is notable that both Kavanaugh and Gorsuch voted not to stay the ruling, and Roberts did.
If you want to our listeners, if you want to view it as optimistically as possible, just remember that the stay may only be until the charade that Ginsburg is still alive is up. But I know that meme's been disproven already because she was out at a supermarket or something like that. I don't know. And but I still think that's funny. Did you guys see that for the last few weeks? They were doing the whole is Ginsburg really alive, or the Democrats just have her body hidden in a room somewhere?
I tell you guys, they wind her up every single day, and then they have to wind her up the next day.
Well,
It's Weekend at Ginsburg's place.
you know, I've never seen that movie yet. I need to see that.
Neither have I, but you know that's it's a big reference. So, speaking of, I really hope. I don't want to. I know what we're trying to wrap up the show, but this does kind of beg the question of, with the State of the Union out of the way, this was one final point I wanted to bring up. Who do you? I'm checking on Twitter, kind of what people's opinions are on the State of the Union, and this as far as like conservative / libertarian Twitter goes, no one can really objectively see how the Democrats are in any better position to win in 2020. I mean, so
if the Democrats wanted to win, they'd nominate Tulsi Gabbard, but that ain't gonna happen.
Nope.
I do think the Democrats are going to run themselves so far to the left that they actually are going to make Schultz run, and Schultz will split the vote, and Trump will win with less than a majority of the vote again.
I just like
that's my prediction.
Pardon?
Oh, I said that's my prediction.
I guess I don't really have a prediction beyond Kamala Harris will be the eventual nominee yet, but I've expressed my support for her. I think for almost 2 years now. Oh, we haven't done the podcast for 2 years, have we? I know I have supported her for at least the last 2 years in writing, if not on the podcast. But I do think we're going to see interesting things from Tulsi as the primary goes on, because she shows just how totally removed their party has become from having a non-interventionist foreign policy. Every time she opens her mouth, the media freaks out about her too. That's the funniest part, because any objective observer knows that she's not going to win the nomination, but every time she opens her mouth, the mainstream media flips out as though this is the woman who's on the verge of getting the nomination and they need to. Have you noticed that too, Gabe?
I haven't. The last I've heard of her was that her campaign was basically fizzling.
I follow Michael Tracy a lot on it, and he always mocks CNN, and he shares these articles that CNN's constantly putting out. The other day they were freaking out because she went on to Morning Joe or something like that, and she said, "Look, Bashar al-Assad is not an enemy of the United States. He's fighting radical Islamic terrorism. He's protecting religious liberty in his country." And she basically said that on, I don't know if it was Morning Joe, it was one of the morning programs, but then immediately afterwards, the Daily Beast, Politico, CNN, they all had these hysterical headlines denouncing her, saying that's not what America is. You, just because you don't have any moral standing at all, you're not allowed to be a serious candidate for the presidency. And they just freaked out. And I was sitting here thinking, it's telling that you guys are this freaked out by a woman who is not even anywhere close to securing the nomination. But it's interesting. I think we'll see interesting things in terms of my realignment theory, which I managed to somehow shoehorn into this episode still now.
I do know. I mean, I do know that every Democrat basically just ran around doing an apology to her for all the bad positions they used to hold on social issues, including Tulsi Gabbard.
She did do that. I thought that was I was disappointed on that. This is another question. Maybe we can do another episode on this. But it floors me when I forget what specifically her faith is. I know it's some sort of variation on Hinduism. But that is why, because she is a woman of faith, that is why she had been so strongly opposed to gay marriage. And as far as I can tell, at least on a personal level, she still is, because they were beating up on her for calling for the way she had talked about it in 2016. But here's my question, though. Why are there so many Democrats like Ilan, I'm butchering her name, but Ilhan Omar, the Muslim congresswoman from Minnesota? She describes herself as a feminist. The Quran says that abortion is a sin. Fornication is a sin. A lot of the things that modern feminism holds up are antithetical to the Islamic tradition, just like they're antithetical to the Christian tradition. So it blows my mind that she is touted as being somehow indicative of their position when she doesn't even believe what's written in the Quran. And it just floors me. And it's the same thing. And maybe she does believe it on the personal level, but then that doesn't translate into her political beliefs. And it just floors me because, again, if you were serious about it, it would be something that should play a role in how you think society ought to be governed, right? So I don't understand. It confuses me when you get to, like, why did Tulsi apologize? Yes, I understand the practical political reasons given her political party. But I don't understand how, at the end of the day, when she's going to bed at night, how she reconciles that with herself, if that makes any sense.
I guess my guess, Josh, would be that she had to do it for political expediency.
I know. I understand the practical political reasons. I don't.
No,
I couldn't do that. I couldn't.
Get it.
I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it depends on how seriously you take your faith. Maybe it's not that seriously in her case, but these are fundamental things that you either believe or you don't. So I will let our listeners know, and you can look it up. I encourage you guys to like it on Facebook as well, because I did. But a friend of mine actually linked me to a group called Muslims for Trump, and I loved their little slogan, which was essentially that an attack on tradition anywhere is an attack on tradition everywhere. And then it said hashtag Make America Great Again, Inshallah, which is essentially Arabic for if God wills it. So Make America Great Again if God wills it, Inshallah. Um, which I thought was cool, but that was
Yeah,
because Gabe knows that's one of my hopes. So I thought it was cool when a friend of mine sent me that Muslims for Trump page.
I think that's pretty cool too. All right, folks. So, what have we been going, gentlemen? About an hour and it's 11:12 now. So, and we started at like 9:12. So, wow, I think almost 2 hours.
We're at some point in the future we'll be like an actual news channel where it just never ends. It's just that we walk away and then some other people come and take over and the news coverage just continues.
The Whitfield Report channel 24/7. You know that's actually kind of what I want to do with this YouTube channel eventually. Once I get enough subs on here, I just want to have like a continuous stream. I don't know how that'll work out, but anyway, for now we'll just strive to be like Joe Rogan and do like 3 hour podcasts at a time. So. But I guess any final remarks that will stretch this out into another hour?
I'm getting pretty hungry for some yogurt, so I don't think I'm gonna drag mine out.
Josh is the honest one here.
Well, Josh, if we had if this podcast had a yogurt sponsor, I would plug it for people, but we don't. So we have Flipboard sponsoring the audio podcast, but that's an app. So um, you, Gabe?
I do not have it. Well, I don't have any final thoughts.
I guess
Right.
I guess my final thought is the left is I think overall Trump did a pretty good job at the State of the Union. I love that I love that we got to see Trump the troll again. So I thought that was great. Uh, look, the leftists suck, and to borrow a phrase from Ben Shapiro, facts and biological and biological fact doesn't care about your feelings either.
If I may
Um,
chime in one last time, now that you mentioned
sure,
it,
sure,
did
yeah.
that guy who was questioning it, did he ever have a follow up, or did we have any more live questions?
No, I don't think it was really. I don't think it was really questioning it. I think it was like more of a point about how, uh, you know, how basically white supremacists. If we were to follow that logic, it's horrible. It would be horrible for everyone's immune systems. We would all die. So
Yeah, I just was wondering if we had any more live questions because I kind of
no,
our listeners chime in, and I thought maybe at the end we can review and see if we missed anybody.
YouTube. This is okay. So thank you for bringing this up because I do want to address this on air before we sign off. So I guess this is my last final thought too, regarding the show and whatnot. People have been DMing me and whatnot, saying that the YouTube streams for this show and for the Whitfield Report haven't been popping up on your mobile feed for the last few weeks. And ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. That's not on our end. YouTube is just not giving notifications for any channels whatsoever lately. It's a big bug. It's not just conservative channels. That's what people think, but none of the tech channels or whatnot I subscribe to have been giving me notifications either. So I've complained to YouTube about it, and I encourage you to do the same. But but that's why it's important to subscribe to the audio podcast too, which is out on Mondays, and we should be getting that out too. So at any rate, folks, thanks for listening, and as always, God bless and God save this great nation. We'll see you here next week. Same time, same channel.